Welcome to Off the Record, a legal podcast.
Welcome back to Off the Record. Today we have that special guest, Bill Finn, an attorney at the law offices of Rhett, Burney in South Carolina. Bill helps clients understand their options when they're living apart or considering divorce, and he brings a clear, practical perspective to the process. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about legal separation in South Carolina. What does it really mean? How does it work? And why do so many people get it wrong? Bill, welcome back, sir.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. So yeah, this is legal separation in South Carolina. What does it mean under that law to legally be separated in the state of South Carolina?
Yeah. So, a lot of times you hear people say, well, I'm separated. Well,
Right.
in South Carolina, that's not necessarily a legal status. How it works is if you have fault grounds for a divorce, and one of those is 1 year's continuous separation, that's actually a no fault ground. And you can't ask for that until you've already been separated for a year. But what you can do once you have separated is file an order for separate support and maintenance. What that does is it lets you resolve all the other issues except for the divorce in your case. So you can get, child custody, visitation, support, all your financial, property, asset, debt division, all worked out in advance of the divorce. And that's what you would file an action for an order of separate support and maintenance. And then you would work that out either by agreement or by trial. And then you'd have an order of separate support and maintenance. And that would say, these parties are separated, but you're not yet divorced at that time. Because again, to get the divorce on the no fault grounds, you have to be already separated for 1 year continuously. So that's kind of how that process works in South Carolina, is you can get an order of separate support and maintenance in advance of your 1 year's continuous separation divorce.
South Carolina doesn't technically have that legal separation, like you said. So what's the real term for it? How is it different from just flat out divorce?
There's not a designated term necessarily. You are just have an order of separate support and maintenance until you're divorced. South Carolina is a pretty conservative state, and you're married till you're not.
How does that separate maintenance and support order work? Why would someone file for that instead of a divorce?
Yeah, so again, because you can't ask for the divorce until you've already been separated for a year. Now, unless you have a fault ground, adultery, something like that, but we're
Wow.
talking no fault grounds here. So you can't actually ask for the divorce until you've been separated for a year. Well, if you've been separated for 2 weeks already and you don't want to wait the whole year to figure out how you're going to divide all your property, assets, debts, how you're going to handle your finances, how you're going to handle your child issues, and who's going to have custody, who's going to have visitation, who's going to pay any support. Very often you can't wait a year to figure those things out. When a lot of times people need those things figured out right away when they separate, because you've got to be able to support yourself in the meantime. So that's why you'd want to file the action for separate support and maintenance, because you can get all those things worked out, get everybody set into their new life and where things are going prior to the divorce. And then when it comes time for the divorce, you just petition the court at that point for the divorce solely, because you've already resolved everything in the separate support and maintenance action.
What types of issues can the court decide while a couple is living apart? Like, custody support, property use, things like that.
Yeah, basically everything except the divorce you can get figured out ahead of time. The only sticking point is you've got to be separated. So sometimes we'll say, well, we're still living in the same home. Well, that's cohabitating. That's not separating.
Yep.
You also have to be continuously separated is the important part too. So there's no back and forth, but you can get everything worked out ahead of time. All your account division, any retirement division, dealing with property, assets, debts, those child issues. Again, you can get everything worked out ahead of time, just except for the divorce itself.
So you kind of said like living separately for a year doesn't automatically mean you're divorced. So people have to take final steps. I know they can't file until it's a year, but how does that work out if they have been away from each other for a year and they are to them they are divorced, to them they are separated, to them it is over? How's that work out?
Yeah, so you're not divorced until you have a court order saying you are. So, a lot of times people think, well, we've been separated for a year. Am I divorced now? No, you're not. You still have to have a court order saying that you are divorced. And that's generally a hearing. And you have to have a corroborating witness as well. So the parties are testifying that they have been continuously separated for more than the last year. And then you have another party there as well, an independent party who can say, I know these people, I've known them for more than last year, and I can testify that they have been continuously separated for the last year. And then the court can grant that divorce. It's in the court's discretion, but generally, if you meet those factors, you're going to get granted the divorce. And that's when you're actually divorced. You have to have that order that says the divorce is granted. Otherwise, you're married until you're not.
With all that being said, what are some common mistakes you see people make, when they separate without a court order or that written agreement?
Yeah, so a lot of times there's informal agreements, right? I'm going to pay for this, you're going to pay for this while we're separated. Well, if you don't have a court order saying who's going to pay for what and who really has to, and a lot of the times people kind of start backing out on those agreements, or they start handling things differently or not in the way it was mutually understood to be in the beginning. So it's just a very common pitfall is that, we thought we could work these out until we get to the 1 year. Well, oftentimes you can't. And oftentimes when you're going through divorce, it's probably because you and the other side don't necessarily always see eye to eye. And so that's why it's a good idea to file these separate support and maintenance actions to figure these things out legally and say who is responsible for what. And by court order, who's going to be paying what, because you just never know how things are going to shake out. You never know what course of action is life going to take. And it's just a good idea to get all these things worked out by court order versus, trusting informal agreements that nobody really has the right to come back and enforce with the court.
Yeah, so but you talked about not being divorced even if you're separated. Can you, let's say you're one person is, like dating someone or doing something, can that hurt like the divorce proceedings at all? Are you allowed to do that? Can that or that can that mess things up?
Yeah, no. So you definitely are not divorced until you are in South Carolina. So I would say you're married until you're divorced. It's not, I always recommend all my clients, even if you've got an order separate support and maintenance, just don't date anyone until your divorce is done. Now, if you've already worked out everything and you've already worked out alimony and those sorts of things, it's not necessarily going to have a huge impact on the divorce itself, but it kind of depends on the facts of the case and what's been worked out already. So, the safe answer is don't date until you're divorced. South Carolina is a conservative state, and I advise all my clients to say just wait until you're divorced. And no, it's not that much longer.
If one spouse moves out, how does that affect the financial responsibilities like that mortgage, the bills, or those joint accounts you were talking about?
Yeah, so if there's still, marital assets, then they're still responsible. Both parties are still responsible for them. But if one spouse moves out and the other spouse is still staying there, the spouse that moves out is probably going to be out of sight, out of mind about it. So that's why it's important to go through the court system and get an order saying who's going to pay for what, how are we going to split these payments, how are we going to divide all these things? Because, the party that's leaving probably doesn't really necessarily have as much of an investment in how that asset shakes out or how it's going to be maintained, but the party that's staying in the home might need the assistance. And so it's just a good idea to go through the court and get these things worked out through the court and with an order, because otherwise you're just taking someone's good faith and you never know how that's going to shake out. You never know where that's going to end up. If they stop making payments on assets, things start getting, repossessed or fall into foreclosure. It just certainly complicates everything. And those are just issues everyone wants to avoid. Want to have the cleanest break and just kind of everybody go their separate ways, but with as little complication as possible.
Can separation have an impact on things like health insurance or coverage of tax filing status?
Yeah, so it can. In regards to taxes, it really depends how the parties agree to file them, right? Because if you're still married, you can do married filing jointly. You can do married filing separately. You have to file one of those until you're divorced, but you can still do those things. With health insurance as well. Generally, the divorce decree itself is that qualifying life event to kind of get someone removed from the health insurance. So generally, you need the actual divorce decree, but sometimes you can get it done a little earlier. It kind of depends on the insurance carrier and those sorts of things. But generally, you need that actual divorce decree to say, okay, this person can come off my insurance now. And then they need that as well to get their own insurance instead of waiting for an open enrollment period or those sorts of things.
So Bill, for someone listening who's thinking about living apart but isn't ready for that divorce, what's the best way to protect themselves legally right from the start?
So yeah, the best way is to make sure none of your assets are falling into any foreclosure or getting repossessed. You're not getting behind on anything. Generally, if those assets are getting repossessed or they're on the verge of it or something like that, both parties are generally speaking going to be responsible. So you want to make sure that you're not doing anything to let your own assets or property or the other side's property go into any kind of situation where now we've got to dig it out of a hole or now we've got to reimburse something or pay extra expenses that weren't necessary. So it's a good idea, even if you're separated, to make sure that both parties have an understanding of what these expenses are, who's going to be paying for what, how are we going to maintain these things while we resolve it on a final basis, especially if we don't have a court order saying how you're going to do that yet. So it's just a good idea to have a good grasp on everything, to understand exactly what your expenses are, be involved in the financial side of your marriage and or upcoming divorce, and just have a full picture. It's going to help out both parties in the end because there's going to be less surprises. There's going to be less digging out of holes. There's going to be less figuring out extra debt that just wasn't necessary.
Awesome. Bill, appreciate the time, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, and that's it for today's episode of Off the Record with special guest Bill Finn of the law offices of Rhett Burney. To connect with Bill or the firm, visit rhettburney.com. Thanks for listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, leave a review, and share this information with someone else that might find it helpful. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.